the show tonight, bombshell reports about Donald Trump and the grenades that he is hurling back. The Republican nominee for president of the United States is facing a flood of new accusations of sexual assault and predatory behavior. Since yesterday morning, more than a dozen women have come forward with reports by more than half a dozen different media organizations describing encounters with Trump that are remarkably similar to each other and mirror the acts that Trump boasted about in that Access Hollywood video. Getting the most notice is a story published last night by the New York Times, which quotes two women who claim Trump made unwanted physical advances on them decades ago. A separate first-person account by a former People magazine reporter claims that Trump did the same to her in 2005. Trump's response to all of these accusations has been swift and venomous. His campaign lashed out at the New York Times, threatening to sue the Gray Lady. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And this afternoon, a defiant Trump looked visibly enraged while addressing the claims at a rally in West Palm Beach, Florida.
These lies come from outlets whose past stories and past claims have already been discredited. The media outlets did not even attempt to confirm the most basic facts, because even a simple investigation would have shown that these were nothing more than false smears. Then there was a writer from People magazine who wrote a story on Melania and myself on our first anniversary. The story was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was lovely. But last night we hear that after 12 years, this took place 12 years ago, this story, a new claim that I made inappropriate advances during the interview to this writer. And I ask a very simple question. Why wasn't it part of the story that appeared 20 or 12 years ago? Why wasn't it part of the story? Why didn't they make it part of the story? I was one of the biggest stars on television with The Apprentice, and it would have been one of the biggest stories of the year. Think of it. She's doing a story on Melania, who's pregnant at the time, and Donald Trump, our one-year anniversary. And she said, I made inappropriate advances. And by the way, the area was a public area, people all over the place. Take a look. You take a look. Look at her words. You tell me what you think. I don't think so. I don't think so. But it is amazing, doing a story, a love story, on how great we are together. And by the way, we're stronger today than we ever were before, which is great. But it's a love story. It's a love story on our 1 year. And if I did that, she would have added that. It would have been the headline. And who would have done that if you're doing this and you're one of the top shows on television? These people are horrible people. They're horrible, horrible liars. And interestingly, it happens to appear 26 days before our very important election. Isn't that amazing? This invented account has already been debunked by eyewitnesses who were there. They were there. The very witness identified by the author has said the story is totally false. By the way, this is a room that everybody can see, and it's got glass walls. It's at Mar-a-Lago. It's got glass walls. Can you believe this? Why wasn't it in the story, biggest story of the year?
When the Trump campaign sent out a transcript of that speech, they suspiciously left out that part where Trump seemed to ridicule the People magazine reporter for her looks. Trump has previously threatened to counter allegations like these by bringing up dirt on Bill Clinton's sexual past and Hillary Clinton's complicity in it, as he sees it, a strategy that is being championed by Trump campaign CEO Steve Bannon, according to reporting by Bloomberg Businessweek's Josh Green. But that line of attack was noticeably absent from Trump's speech in Florida today. Meanwhile, on the non-scandal side, a brand new Bloomberg Politics poll shows Hillary Clinton leading Donald Trump by a wide margin in Pennsylvania, and new NBC Wall Street Journal Marist polls in Ohio and North Carolina suggest that the race is still pretty tight in those states. But those polls have obviously been overshadowed by the crisis raining down on Donald Trump's campaign. So, Mark Halpern, my friend, how do you think, on the basis of this past 24 hours, the Trump campaign is handling this crazy moment?
We'll come back to the polls in greater detail, but I got to tell you, those who said, like Joe Scarborough, that maybe Donald Trump would not collapse in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape in the debate, there's some evidence now that they're right. Trump is way down nationally. He's way down in Pennsylvania. But if those Ohio and North Carolina polls are right, it's too easy, as the New York Times and others are saying, to say, and Politico and others, well, this race is over. Trump's electoral college path isn't there. He's still got a really narrow path. He's still behind. But the polls suggest that there's more going on than just a downward trajectory for Trump. Now, Donald Trump's playbook right now is a lot like the Clinton playbook from the 90s, when they were trying to discredit women who were making accusations against Bill Clinton. Raise questions about their stories, raise questions about the timing, say that the forces for status quo want to keep things the way they are, and that's why they're bringing up these false negative stories, blame the press. That's right out of the Clinton playbook. There's two differences that are pretty fundamental. One is Donald Trump's doing a lot of this himself, and that's a danger. And two, he's doing it in an angry way. You can search long and hard. You won't find too many cases where Bill Clinton personally attacked his accusers. I think those are two big differences that are potentially big problems for Donald Trump.
Well, there's another big difference, right? It's never been the case, although Bill Clinton has been accused by various people. And again, I'll stress that Bill Clinton is not running in this campaign. But although he's been attacked, he was accused by various women, he never faced anything like what we saw last night. Just the number of accusations all coming in a giant wave. All of them, as I said earlier, remarkably consistent in the stories they tell and remarkably consistent in terms of what Trump boasted of in the Access Hollywood tape. Given those things, given those realities, it seems to me the burden of proof is not on these women. The burden of proof is on Donald Trump. And right now, all he's saying is the stories are ridiculous. They're lies. He's not actually disputing them in any detailed way or in any credible way. So I think if he's going to get past this, he's going to have to do better than just yelling liar, liar, and also ridiculing the looks of one of the women who wrote the most powerful first-person account so far. This is not the strategy to get past this, I don't think.
He's promised rebuttal evidence. We'll wait for that.
Yeah.
Every accuser, man or woman, every accuser deserves a chance to be heard. And the strength of these accounts, for the most part, is they have contemporaneous people who they told at the time or corroborating witnesses. But I will say, if the Democratic nominee for president had 6 or 7 media organizations all on one night coming forward, people would say, well, that's suspicious. 3 weeks before the election, this is all coming forward. Lastly, I'll say I know the bell rang, which is the reason I think they all came out at once is because all these news organizations were jumping on it because they wanted to be part of not being last.
Well, also
so the timing can be explained by that and by what Trump said at the debate.
Yes. And again, I know the bell's gone off, but let's face it here. Like, Donald Trump invited these women to come forward when he came out on the debate stage on Sunday night and denied ever doing this. And for a lot of these women for whom this is a painful experience, most of them, if not all of them, have no interest in being in the public spotlight, in reliving these experiences, in being trashed by Donald Trump. He provoked this, and it's actually sort of, it seems perfectly explicable to me that we would see these stories a few days later when these women saw him on stage on Sunday night and then came forward.
Yeah, all right, we're going to move on here. Donald Trump is waging a war in the media now, as we said, as part of his fight back. He's mostly targeted, as Republicans often do, the New York Times. Last night, after the paper's story posted on its website, Trump's campaign swiftly called for a retraction. They threatened legal action against the Gray Lady, a warning that Trump repeated himself today in West Palm Beach.
The slander and libels that was just last night thrown at me by the Clinton machine and the New York Times and other media outlets as part of a concerted, coordinated, and vicious attack. These vicious claims about me of inappropriate conduct with women are totally and absolutely false. And the Clintons know it, and they know it very well. These claims are all fabricated. They're pure fiction, and they're outright lies. These events never, ever happened, and the people that said them meekly fully understand. You take a look at these people, you study these people, and you'll understand also.
Times legal team responded to the Trump campaign today with a terse letter that read, in part, quote, nothing in our article has had the slightest effect on the reputation that Mr. Trump, through his own words and actions, has already created for himself. We published newsworthy information about a subject of deep public concern. If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who dare to criticize him to stand silent or be punished, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight. John, in this fight now that's still escalating between the paper of record and the Trump campaign, who's going to win?
Well, I'll tell you what's not going to happen and who's not going to win in a legal case is Donald Trump. I don't think he'll ever file a legal case because he would face discovery, for one thing. And I also don't think he'll ever file the legal case because he would lose. We have a law in this country around libel. It's governed by a case called New York Times versus Sullivan, where in order to win a libel case, you need to be able to prove that the media outlet exhibited actual malice, knowledgeable falsity, or reckless disregard for the truth. None of these stories, especially these in the Times, come anywhere close to meeting that standard. So there will be no lawsuit, and the Times will, at least on that level, I don't know about in the court of public opinion or politics, but on the level of legality, the New York Times wins this case hands down.
Every news organization in the country has to report with care on WikiLeaks now, on Trump accusations. We're close to the election. Everybody has to take care. Getting it right is more important than fast. The Times story seems perfectly appropriate. They talked to the women involved. They asked the Trump campaign for a response. They did talk to some of the other people involved. But it's possible that the women's accounts are not wholly accurate. Even possible that they're not both not telling the truth. Possible. The paper, though, gave them a chance to tell their stories. They gave Donald Trump a chance to respond. What I object to is I think the paper's making a big mistake, even though it's the lawyers and not the editors, in fighting with Donald Trump and making additional sort of ad hominem accusations against him. They should do their speaking in the paper in their journalism. They did some great journalism yesterday. And they should do their arguing in court if necessary. But to put that letter in public, making those kind of accusations, if my news organization did that, I would be uncomfortable. We have to be fair and even in this campaign, and not basically take sides and say this is an accurate portrayal of who Donald Trump is.
I don't look at what they said was in that paragraph was they listed things that Trump has said himself and then said, you know, these are all things that Trump's image has not been damaged because Trump has brought a lot of this on himself, and they quoted his own words. I mean, how is that? Right. How is that an ad hominem?
Because they're putting his finger, ad hominem may not be the right phrase, but they're putting their finger on the scale against him more than they need to do to commit the journalism that they did. And that should speak for itself, I think. The lawyers are trying to win a legal argument, not trying to uphold the standards of the paper, as far as I'm concerned.
Didn't bother me that much. All right, up next, we will talk about how the Clinton campaign is responding to this moment of high drama and real sleaze and slime and sludge when we come back.
Donald Trump got hit with new accusations of sexual impropriety last night. The communications director for Hillary Clinton's campaign, Jennifer Palmieri, responded with a scathing statement saying the New York Times story, quote, fits everything we know about the way Donald Trump has treated women. At a fundraiser in San Francisco today, Hillary Clinton herself told donors that Trump's campaign was engaging in, quote, scorched earth attacks, but she has not engaged very much in public on these accusations. Instead, the Clinton campaign is pointing to the remarks of one of Clinton's most powerful super surrogates, the First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama, who took the stage in New Hampshire today and delivered what is widely being called a remarkable and deeply emotional rebuke of Trump, his past rhetoric about women, and the behavior that's now alleged.
This is not something that we can ignore. It's not something we can just sweep under the rug as just another disturbing footnote in a sad election season. Because this was not just a lewd conversation. This wasn't just locker room banter. This was a powerful individual speaking freely and openly about sexually predatory behavior and actually bragging about kissing and groping women, using language so obscene that many of us were worried about our children hearing it when we turn on the TV. And to make matters worse, it now seems very clear that this isn't an isolated incident. It's one of countless examples of how he has treated women his whole life. And I have to tell you that I listen to all of this, and I feel it so personally. And I'm sure that many of you do too, particularly the women. The shameful comments about our bodies, the disrespect of our ambitions and intellect, the belief that you can do anything you want to a woman. It is cruel. It's frightening. And the truth is, it hurts.
So, John, that's the most powerful and emotional part of the Clinton response. How are they handling the situation overall politically?
They are staying out of Donald Trump's way, letting him continue to dig the hole deeper, and deferring to Michelle Obama, who, at both the convention and in that speech, has proven to be, I think, right now, the best surrogate in the Democratic Party, including better than her husband.
Yeah, she was powerful today, and again, both sides are being so hypocritical about accusations like this, both historically and now. The First Lady, though, reminding everybody, in a political way clearly, but in a powerful way, that people deserve to be heard and not attacked if they come forward. I think the Clinton campaign is so obviously pleased that the WikiLeaks thing is getting very little attention, much to the Trump campaign's frustration. But this gives them a break from having to answer detailed questions, although the press is still working on all those questions.
All right, let's just note quickly, Michelle Obama did not want to be in politics. She hated the idea of her husband running for president, and somehow over 8 years, she has turned out to be a superstar.
Yep. All right, up next, we're going to talk to a People magazine editor who's involved in the Trump accusation, the story that they ran last night. We're going to talk about the story and the reporter who wrote it right after this.
Budweiser.com.
Late last night, People magazine published a first-person account of a former staff writer at the magazine, Natasha Stoyanov, who claims that she was assaulted by Donald Trump while covering his one-year anniversary to his wife Melania in 2005. According to that story, Trump allegedly pinned her to a wall, forcibly kissed her, and later told the woman, quote, "You know we're going to have an affair, don't you?" With us in a moment to talk about that article is the magazine's senior editor, Charlotte Triggs. We're getting Charlotte on the line momentarily. Here she comes, Charlotte Triggs, with us now. Mark, we're still waiting for Charlotte to get mic'd up.
I can hear you. Can you hear
What was your reaction when you read this piece last night online?
I mean, I think it's a powerful thing to come from a reporter with contemporaneous and a lot of specifics and a contemporaneous account and no clear motive to do anything but try to tell the truth. That's what makes it, to me, one of the more difficult ones for the Trump campaign to respond to.
All right, let's bring in Charlotte right now, who I think is ready to join us. Charlotte, are you there?
Yes. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Charlotte. Thanks for being there. Just give us a little brief backstory about how this story came about, what motivated Natasha to write it, and what brought it out at this time.
Right. Now, Natasha worked for us, years ago, up until 2009. This incident happened in 2005, and it's something that she wanted to keep quiet because she didn't want to disrupt her life, and she didn't want to face the retaliation from Trump at the time that she knew was very much possible and part of his MO. And once she saw Anderson Cooper, asking him at the debate whether he had ever actually acted on the things he said on that Access Hollywood tape about groping women, about forcibly kissing them, and he said no, she felt a moral obligation to come forward and to tell the story and to say, no, he's lying and that is not true.
You guys have said throughout this day that you guys carefully vetted the story. Can you just give me a sense of what that vetting entailed?
I really can't get into the mechanics of it, but I can say that we took this extremely seriously, and that, obviously we consulted our legal team and vetted it thoroughly, and that we stand by the story.
Charlotte, People magazine, you guys write about political figures all the time, but this is about the most politically impactful thing you all have ever done. Was there any questioning within the magazine or at Time Inc. about doing such a thing that clearly would have an impact on the campaign?
Well, actually, People has a great tradition of covering the elections, and we get some of the best access of any outlets, actually. If you're going to look at it and look at our history, we've had great access with all of the candidates traditionally. And we don't shy away from these sorts of major issues, particularly something that is going to have such ramifications as this. When Natasha told us that she was open to discussing this for the first time, we were actually very, very serious about publishing it.
How widely known before the debate on Sunday was her experience and her account within the magazine?
When Natasha came back from Mar-a-Lago back in 2005, she told her closest friend and confidant and colleague here at the magazine what had happened, but she didn't take it up the chain. So this is not something that had ever made its way to upper management. So it was not widely known. There were a handful of people who were extremely close to her who had been aware of it but kept the secret out of respect for her at her request.
Charlotte, I want to ask you about two things Donald Trump said today in his speech this afternoon related to your story. The first is he said, the very witness identified by the author said the story is totally false. I've been trying to figure out what he's referring to there. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
It's possible that he's referring to the butler. Natasha describes the butler having walked in on them and interrupting the kiss that he, forced upon her. However, he's not clear and he's not specific. And I would also point out that the butler is employed by him. So we're not certain exactly who he's referring to. It could also be the masseuse that had witnessed told Natasha that Donald Trump had been waiting for her at her massage appointment. Again, somebody employed by Trump, and he also doesn't specify. So we're not sure what he's referring to, but he has not gotten specific with any details that would discredit the story.
Right. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to raise is this thing that, interestingly, today there was when the campaign put out its official transcript of the speech, they left one part out. The part that they left out was the part where he said, referring to Natasha, "You take a look at her. Her words, you tell me what you think, I don't think so." I'd just like to get your thoughts on that remark about your former reporter.
Well, obviously, as we, heard that, we were all disgusted by that remark. And, it's secondary. It really, honestly, his opinion of anybody's physical appearance is secondary to the issue and doesn't matter. However, it's really interesting that anybody on his team might have felt compelled to edit that out. And I think it just speaks to the fact that they know that it was not the right thing to say.
Charlotte Trigg, since you published your story, have you heard from any other women with new accounts of alleged behavior by Donald Trump?
We are continuing to report on this, but we don't have anything new yet to add in terms of additional women.
All right.
But there have been, I think the tally is about up to 5 now, who have come forward to various outlets discussing similar experiences.
Okay, Charlotte Triggs, thank you so much for being on the show. Really grateful. When we come back, we'll talk to 2 campaign strategists about the state of this race and what it's like to labor in a crisis environment like the one currently afflicting the Trump campaign. We'll talk to them after this.
What was last Friday afternoon like for you and your family as you processed what you were hearing from this Access Hollywood tape?
Well, listen, I mean, there's sort of the reality of the situation, and then there's how the media portrays it again. I think most American people can say, you know what, I've probably said those kind of things to myself. So, we're not happy that you said it, that's for sure. I get that. But, I think it means that he's a human being, that he's a regular person like everyone else. And I think that's what's endeared him to the American public.
Donald Trump Jr. speaking to a local North Carolina radio station earlier today. We've never seen anything like this race for president, but we did bring in 2 political strategists who have seen a thing or two within campaigns that require some crisis management. So joining us now to talk about how the 2 campaigns are handling the events of the week, Jonathan Prince, a former deputy campaign manager for John Edwards' presidential bid and an advisor to both Clintons, and Susan Del Percio, a Republican strategist who worked for many, including former mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani. Thank you both for coming in. Jonathan, let me ask you, what risks is Donald Trump taking from your point of view with the strategy he's currently pursuing to fight back against these allegations?
Well, he's basically dared every political reporter and political enthusiast and part-time political hobbyist in America to go find other women over the course of his, some 60 years of interacting with women to discover whether or not he's, done anything else inappropriate. I mean, he's put a giant, bullseye on his back, and that's probably a violation of about 16 different rules of crisis management. So that's the first thing that screams out to me, just in terms of his own strategy.
Susan, Jonathan is a Democrat supporting Hillary Clinton for president. You're a Republican. Who are you supporting for president?
I'm not supporting either the Republican or Democratic nominee this year.
Okay, we got that down. So let me ask you about how the Trump campaign is handling it. Within the Trump campaign, one thing that really interests me now is, do the advisors he around him now have any idea what the facts are in not just these allegations, but what else might be coming? Is it dangerous if they don't know the facts?
They don't know the facts because early on, Donald Trump's campaign, or Donald Trump himself, said he did not want a vulnerability study done. They never went in themselves to find out where he was vulnerable and find these people. They would have found the tape. So since he's never done that, of course the campaign staff doesn't know, because you can't, Donald Trump, we know, kind of interprets events as he chooses.
So when you were working for John Edwards, and you were constantly in 2008, there were small eruptions, rumors. None of it ever really came out in a full-blown way like this. It did not come out till after. But when those things were occurring, right, did your boss ever say to you, man, I want to hit the media, I want to attack the media, and you had to, like, talk him off that ledge?
No, not even close. I mean, that would have been the second point that I would have gone to in terms of Mark's first question. Not a chance. He understood that what we were trying to do here, putting aside whether the rumors about him were true or not, was to stop coverage. And the way you stop coverage is not asking for more coverage, not begging for more coverage, not picking fights with, as they say, the people that, ink by the barrel is no longer, they've got bites and bits by the barrel now.
Well, and just to add on to that, you don't say, I'm going to prove this to you and create another day's story, because now all reporters are going to say is, you said you were going to offer us proof. Where's the proof?
Here's the question I have, though. The whole thing that opened the door to this, it seems to me, although the door in some ways was open the whole time, but really what triggered it, right, was he's in the debate. Anderson Cooper says to him, after the Access Hollywood tape came out, says, have you ever actually done anything apart from talking about it? What would you, in that moment, if you worked for Donald Trump and could freeze time, what would you say, here's the right answer to that question, Anderson? Because clearly, it's a tough question, right? You can't say, I mean, if you're going to say, yes, actually, I have done those things. I mean, what should you say at that moment on the debate stage to not trigger all these women to now come forward?
There was nothing that was going to happen that wasn't going to trigger these women. I mean, yes, the Anderson Cooper debate certainly added to it, but we started to see a slow drip. Now, some of it was through op research and the Team Clinton getting those women out there. Another is now just having multiple people out there. Women can come forward because they're not afraid of just being sued by Donald Trump. It's the Bill Cosby effect, much different charges, but I'm not the only one, or he's not going to sue me or take me to court. And so I think they feel comfortable going forward now.
So step back even further than the debate. Step back to when the Access Hollywood tape came out, which that really is the trigger for all of this, right? Because you've got your boss on tape saying these things where he's condoning and bragging about sexual assault. When that happened, there was a lot of discussion in Trump world about how to deal with it. Should he do a big network interview? Should he apologize? Should he be contrite? He decided not to do any of those things, instead went the opposite direction. What would you have advised Donald Trump on that last Friday night, when the tape first came out, if you were in Trump Tower?
Obviously, as Marcus said, I'm a Hillary Clinton supporter. But with that, I get.
You know some Democrats who've gotten in some pretty bad trouble before,
but
right?
One of the things that's always happened with candidates that I've worked for have been in trouble is they actually have some regret. There's some element of remorse. And one of the big things that we know to be true about apologies is, and voters in particular, is they've got a great nose for sincerity. And apologies really only work when people think they did something wrong. So you tell me how you advise Donald Trump, who probably doesn't think anything he said on that tape is bad. He just doesn't get it. How do you tell him to go out there and give a sincere apology? He's not capable of it.
Susan, I'm fascinated by this question for history. Is it possible that all the 15 other Republicans who ran for president committed malpractice by not ferreting this stuff out? And if they had, would it have stopped Donald Trump from being the nominee?
Well, I think at the end of the day, some of them just didn't want to spend the money on the opposition research that you needed to do. And it was political malpractice not going after them, looking at it today. Because at the time, none of the Republicans wanted to go after Trump directly because they knew he would just take them down and chop them off at the knees. That being said, there's certainly a lot of donors who played it wrong, saying, well, Donald Trump's going to back out. They could have gotten together and done a super PAC just to take him down, which would have been historically, I think, the right way to go.
Jonathan, are you surprised that these new NBC polls show both North Carolina and Ohio still quite competitive, even after the relatively rough week that Trump has had?
I'm never surprised in American politics, in American presidential politics, when competitive states are competitive. It's just because there are so many issues that go to core voting decision that don't have to do with the candidates. I wish, to some extent, that the character issues were taken more into consideration, but they're not.
Let me ask you both real quickly. Trump has attacked the media. He's been attacking the Republican Party. He obviously attacks the Clintons all the time. There's now a theory advanced by Steve Bannon and some others in the campaign that they should make these last 3 weeks in order to get through this crisis, just drag the Clintons all the way down as deep into the mud as they can, go after Bill Clinton more than they already have on his personal life, Hillary Clinton's complicity as they see it in that. Is that a winning strategy? Is that, given where they are right now, they're behind, and it's hard to imagine how they catch up. Is there any rationality to the notion of the only way to do this is just to scorch the earth, leave us both in the dust, drive down turnout, and hope for the best?
No, it depends what you define as winning. To win the presidency, this is a horrible way to go. But to make Hillary Clinton the weakest president ever to step into the Oval Office and then create some kind of news network and say, I told you so, it's probably a good strategy.
What do you think?
Can't disagree with that. I mean, there's no circumstance under which that strategy elects someone president of the United States.
Well, and it could actually, if it goes as far as he's willing to, that they say they're going to go, it also, he may be able to do something that Hillary Clinton hasn't been able to do, is motivate voters there. This may, he may just go too far and women come out and vote for Hillary Clinton because they're so disgusted with him.
Look, the other thing is he becomes such a caricature of himself that he almost begins to delegitimize, this would be my hope anyway, delegitimize some of the long history of kind of really vitriolic attacks against the Clintons. I mean, that press conference before the debate was among the most absurd things I've ever seen in politics.
Okay, Jonathan Prince, Susan Del Percio, both crisis experts impervious to all crises. Thank you both. A little news, Bill Clinton has called Michelle Obama's speech from earlier today the best speech given in this campaign by anybody. We'll take a break, come back. We're going to talk to the Libertarian vice presidential candidate, Bill Weld, right after this. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. Right back with Bill Weld after this.
Right to my right over here, former governor of Massachusetts and now the Libertarian candidate for vice president, Bill Weld, joins us. Sir, I got to start just by asking you, what are your thoughts as a intelligent, educated, and civil man on the events of the past 24 hours in presidential politics.
I'm somewhat stirred by the last 2 days because I think that Governor Johnson and I can do a service to the United States and maybe a service to the Republican Party by putting ourselves forward as a fiscally responsible and free trade promoting ticket, which neither of the other two tickets is. And that would help the country by giving voters an alternative. It might even help the Republican Party by giving Republican voters a place to go on the presidential ballot, and then they could stay and vote for the down ballot Republicans.
That was a pretty odd message answer. Good, kind of getting out the vote for the Libertarian ticket answer. I'm just asking you kind of a more human, like, have you ever seen anything like this? Like what, like just, it feels to me like, I mean, this whole campaign's had a lot of unprecedented moments and crazy stuff, but this seems like particularly dirty and kind of just like everyone feels like, that I talk to, kind of feels like they need to take a shower right now.
Well, I'm not believing what Mr. Trump says about how I didn't really do all those things I said I did, because I just don't believe it. I mean, and I've spent a lot of time in the courtroom and seen witnesses and circumstantial evidence, and you know, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 11, and it sounds like Donald doing it, that is. So I don't believe it. So he's staking everything on what appears to be a lie, but it's not the first time, you know?
Right.
So.
It's true. So you're firmly in the he's lying, he's obviously guilty camp.
Oh, I think he's obviously lying. Yeah. No, I mean, to know the guy is to know that he loves women. He loves hitting on women. So why he would deny it, I'll tell you why he's going to deny it. He's trying to make this issue the New York Times and not him. So he spent like an hour and a half talking about the New York Times. So, you know, Joe the Ragman can say, oh, this is about the New York Times. I don't like the New York Times. They're way up there in New York. So I'm going to be with Donald. So he's just trying to associate himself with the opposite of the New York Times.
Here comes Mark.
Governor, I want to ask you about a complicated debate that's not really being had by the country because there's all this other stuff going on. It involves national security and espionage and First Amendment and privacy. Should news organizations be reporting on these documents, which are allegedly, according to WikiLeaks, John Podesta's emails, they haven't been authenticated. So should news organizations be reporting on them or not?
Did you not hear Mark?
I'm not getting sound, no.
Oh, he's not hearing, guys, he's not hearing Mark, but I'll ask the question for Mark. Mark's asking the question about WikiLeaks. So the question is, given we're in a brave new world of leaks, there are a lot of news organizations are trying to figure out whether they should be reporting on purloined material, essentially, things that have been, somebody's broken in by in a computer, taken things out of the Clinton campaign, the DNC's personal files and the DNC files. How do you feel about that question?
That doesn't slow me down. You mean fruit of the poisonous tree? But they're not the government. The Fourth Estate is not the government. Right. I think they can report it and say, we don't know whether this is authentic or not, and give the campaign in question a chance to deny it. But I don't see not using the stuff. It's important stuff. Right. I mean, I think the stuff that Snowden did on NSA was important, and this WikiLeaks stuff is the Goldman Sachs speeches, I think, were WikiLeaks. They were important to have them out there that Mrs. Clinton did.
Yeah, and what's your thinking about? I mean, what of all the things you've seen reported from inside the Clinton campaign, which of them do you think rise to the level of genuine importance?
I think not turning over the Huma Abedin emails when Huma Abedin did turn them over, but they didn't come from the Clinton side. Why not? Lawyers airbrushed them. And that was an ouch. Maybe it's good to have a private and a public opinion. Maybe that's an ouch. Maybe the people who really understand what regulations would be best in the financial sector or those who work in the financial sector, those are ouches. Those are three. The first one is a substantial ouch. The second two are PR ouches. But you want to know something? Nobody's going to jail. She's not going to jail. Yeah, right. She's not going close to jail. Yeah.
Let's try Mark again. See if we can hear him.
Governor, what did the Weld Johnson ticket have planned over the course of the remaining balance between now and Election Day?
Well, you know, in view of recent events, it does occur to us that we could be a place for Republican voters to come who just feel now that they cannot vote for Mr. Trump. So we're emphasizing that we're an experienced ticket. You know, we were two-term Republican governors. We not only had 2 terms of experience, but we, by definition, worked across the aisle because we had Democratic states. And so we're a place where they could go. And it's not going to be a hard sell. You have to do it. It's just, hey, would you consider us? And obviously, that's going to go down best in red states where there are more Republican voters. And that may be a little bit of a shift from, I had a lot of blue states on my calendar until recently, and I'm beginning to rethink that a little bit.
And tell us about your campaign activities that are pending. That's your message, but do you plan to do mostly TV interviews, a lot of retail campaigning, rallies? How do you plan to close this out?
Rallies, retail out west, as much New York and D.C. as we can do, for maybe L.A. for national media as well. But getting out there, showing the flag in the West and to some extent in the East, and then trying to raise our name recognition so that the fact that Governor Johnson doesn't have the high negatives of the other two candidates could pay dividends. If we get his name recognition to 70, his poll position would probably go to 25 because he doesn't have 60% negatives. If we're at 25, I've said this before, but if we're at 25 points any time in the month of October, we're dangerous because we have momentum.
I'm going to ask you for a one-word answer, yes or no. If I asked you what to do about Aleppo, would you have had an answer? Yes or no?
Yeah, I would have had an answer, although now I'm so pessimistic I've almost given up. I think Putin's going to have his way because he's willing to bomb anything.
All right. A man who knows what Aleppo is, the #2 man on the Libertarian ticket, Governor Bill Weld. Thank you very much. We'll tell you more about our new Bloomberg Politics Pennsylvania poll right after this.
Brand new Bloomberg Politics poll we mentioned earlier of likely voters in Pennsylvania. Not great news for Donald Trump. The survey shows Republican nominee trails Hillary Clinton in the Keystone State by 9 points, 51 to 42%. We also, though, zeroed in on the key 4 suburban counties around Philadelphia. In those areas, Clinton lead expands to a massive 28 points, 59 to 31. That's much better than Barack Obama did against Mitt Romney. Joining us now to break it down, our pollster and Seltzer in Des Moines, Iowa, as well as the Democratic pollster and strategist Cornell Belcher, who's in our Washington, D.C. bureau. And why did we look at those 4 counties? What is your main takeaway from our survey overall?
Well, those 4 counties were just too tempting to not take a dive if we had the chance. The geography of of elections is that pretty much urban areas are going to tilt more Democratic than the state as a whole. Rural areas are going to tilt more Republican than the state as a whole. But suburbs in every state are sort of, depends on the state, which way they're going to tilt. In Pennsylvania, which is already a swing state, you have these 4 collar counties that are so populated that they truly can be the difference in how the state goes. So we decided to take a look at those 4 counties, throw some extra interviews in them, and it gives quite a stark picture of just how down in a ditch Donald Trump happens to be right now.
Cornell, let me ask you this question. If you look at Hillary Clinton's lead in those 4 counties, those 4 suburban counties around Philadelphia, and it is not just better than how Barack Obama did, but a lot better, way better.
A lot better, right?
So if you took those results and projected them on a lot of other suburbs and a lot of other battleground states, is that not basically like game over for Donald Trump?
Well, look, taking off my partisan hat, if you're at the RNC, I mean, this is the scenario that should keep you up at night long past this coming November, because you know what you're also seeing? You can project that onto the suburbs there around Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Research Triangle in North Carolina. You can project that around what you're seeing in Northern Virginia and around the Tidewater area there in Virginia, where you have these once reliably red states that are growing, better at with more college-educated voters. They are slipping away from the Republican Party. Right? If you have the Trump campaign pulling out of Virginia right now and North Carolina moving toward the Democrat, it's time to hit the panic button at the RNC.
And if you look at our new Pennsylvania poll and the other polling that's out now, anything you can say about Donald Trump's standing today with women as compared to a month ago?
Well, in these 4 counties, 67% are backing Hillary Clinton. So the best Donald Trump could be is a 2-to-1 loss there. There's just so much room to make up. 76% of women in those counties are unfavorable toward Donald Trump. So there's really a lot to sort of begin to do to fight back. We asked a question about that Access Hollywood video that people have been talking about nonstop. And people are bothered by it, and it's not something that appears to be going away. While we were in the field for 5 days, we didn't really see concern about it grow all that much. There was normal variation from day to day. But since we finished the polling on Tuesday night, this has continued to be a big part of the conversation. And when an issue like that has legs like that, we can expect to see people who are already bothered even more.
So, Cornell, the flip side here today in the polling news is if you're sitting in the Trump campaign, you're like, okay, Pennsylvania, we're sort of screwed there. It's going to be hard to win that state. But you look at the polling that we see out of North Carolina, where it's still relatively close, and in Ohio, where Trump's ahead, according to this most recent poll. It would seem to me, if I were in the Trump campaign and I had the week that they've had, I'd be like, those are 2 pretty good polls out of 3 for us. How do you think? How do you respond to that?
Well, the North Carolina poll, I think, is interesting because it has Clinton up and Ohio's a toss-up. But again, if you look at a reliable red state like North Carolina, where you have the polling certainly moving in the wrong direction, and you look at what some people are saying are actually happening in Georgia, and you also look at what's happening in states like Arizona, it is problematic long term. And look, Ohio right now is a toss-up. I would argue that Ohio, from an electoral standpoint, looks a lot like America of the electorate of the past than it does the electorate of the future. If you're looking forward in this country, and again, I mean, I'm not being a partisan hack here, but if you're looking forward here in this country and you're looking at the emerging electorate, it looks like what's happening in North Carolina, it looks like what's happening in Virginia, and it looks like what's happening in places like Arizona and Georgia, where Republicans are struggling and they shouldn't be.
Cornell Belcher, thank you very much. Ann Seltzer, thank you very much. We're going to be right back with more All Due Respect after these quick words from our sponsors.
Check out BloombergPolitics.com and that great piece by Josh Green on what Trump's going to do next coming up on Bloomberg Technology. Sean Layden of PlayStation. Until tomorrow, from me and my friend Mark Halperin, we say to you, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's get a check of first word news. Donald Trump is denying allegations of sexual assault. At a rally in Florida, he said the media and the Clinton campaign are engaged in a coordinated attack against him.
These vicious claims about me of inappropriate conduct with women are totally and absolutely false.
Mr. Trump said he has evidence to disprove the claims and will release it at what he called the appropriate time. Campaigning for Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire, First Lady Michelle Obama said the 2005 video of Donald Trump making vulgar comments about women left her, quote, shaken.
This is disgraceful. It is intolerable. And it doesn't matter what party you belong to, Democrat, Republican, Independent, no woman deserves to be treated this way.
More than 2 years after their abduction became an international cause, 21 of Nigeria's Chibok schoolgirls kidnapped by Boko Haram have been freed. Government officials say they were released in a swap for detained leaders of Islamic State. Nearly 200 girls remain captive. It's unclear how many may have died. Global news 24 hours a day. I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. Bloomberg Technology is next.
And this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, another big round of layoffs at HP as the company weathers intense macroeconomic conditions, and weak sales. We'll bring you the latest. Plus, Verizon says Yahoo's 2014 breach just might affect its pending $4.83 billion acquisition. And Alibaba chairman Jack Ma signals tremendous challenges ahead for e-commerce. Should investors be worried? We'll discuss. First, to our lead. HP Inc. planning to cut as many as 4,000 jobs over the next 3 years. That's on top of 3,000 positions due to be cut by the end of 2016. The legacy PC and printer segments of the old Hewlett-Packard conglomerate have been under pressure because of weak hardware and supply sales. Shares moving lower in extended trading. Our editor-at-large, Corey Johnson, with me now here in the studio, as well as our Bloomberg contributing editor, David Kirkpatrick of Techonomy, joining us from New York. So, Corey,